The new MacBook Pro has MagSafe, function keys, and an SD card reader. Things we've probably reiterated in the news more times than we'd like to admit, because you probably read those types of headlines for this MacBook Pro launch, which you guys all know about, and this MacBook Pro launch as well. In case you weren't aware, while I bought a 16-inch MacBook Pro last year, my wife has actually owned a 15-inch MacBook Pro from mid-2009 for much, much longer. However, she did not buy it new. She bought it used in 2016 for a couple $100, and I thought it might be fun in today's video to compare the two, but just keep in mind that it's not like I owned this MacBook Pro ever since 2009. In fact, I never for an extended period of time used a device like this, but just putting them next to each other, it's kind of interesting to look at what Apple has learned from and also what they haven't learned from and what they kept going with. Let's begin. So we've got nearly 13 years between these two machines. So you would assume, considering the iPhone 4 was not even available when this Mac came out, that Apple would have a lot of drastic changes and you would barely be able to tell the difference with the 2021 MacBook Pro, right? Well, there's actually quite a lot of similarities. For one, MagSafe has made its way back. So yes, we still had a traditional MagSafe connector back in 2009. However, the charge brick is where I notice a lot more of the differences. Thankful to say I've never used a MacBook for an extended period of time at least that had one of these. You know, I was 11 years old when this MacBook came out, and my mom actually owned one pretty similar to this style, and it had a charge brick like this. But now looking back at it, I'm very grateful Apple has moved away from the unremovable MagSafe cable end, and you have these white plastic parts that stick out just so you can wrap the cable up on a trip. But this does not come out, and my god, just charging this MacBook up for the video, this thing gets freaking hot. I have never before in my life seen a 60-watt power adapter get as hot as this thing does. And yeah, the battery, unlike the power brick, is not doing too hot on the 2009 MacBook Pro. I actually wasn't too surprised by how many cycles it had, just over 700, but still warnings throughout all the Mac OS systems saying, you know, battery needs to be serviced, and I can't get a firm number on the battery health other than it's bad. And the few times we have used this since my wife and I have been together, I have often seen it die before it hit 0%, but the good news is it charges up pretty quick. I plugged it in, and before you know it, it was already at 100%. But just like the more recent generation MagSafe, the light still turns green when it's done, it's orange when it's charging. I just was never a fan of there being a box in between two separate cables. I think this is unnecessary, and I absolutely prefer today's approach where you can unplug MagSafe from the brick itself, and the brick stays attached to the wall instead of hanging out somewhere in between. Though I do think MagSafe was a lot weaker back then. I've noticed that if we use this in bed or on the couch or something, it's a lot easier to dislodge this old traditional MagSafe connector compared to MagSafe 3, which feels very, very solid and doesn't pop out too easily for me. But thankfully, Apple also made this cable braided as well. SD card slot wasn't there in between the 13 years, but it was there in 2009, and of course, it has made its way over to the right side with the 2021 MacBook Pro. Both still have headphone jacks, although there is an additional microphone input on the older MacBook, which is no longer there. Of course, mini display port, FireWire, 2 USB-A ports, and so long ago, Apple was still able to stuff a DVD drive in this thing. So in case you're wondering why the heck we were using a 2009 MacBook Pro within the past 5 or 6 years, it's because this was basically our portable DVD player. If we had some old movies or some old TV shows we wanted to watch, there's pretty much no other disk drive in the entire house. None of my computers have one. We don't have a console, we don't have a Blu-ray player or anything, so this MacBook was essentially all we had to play those old discs, and it mostly did a good job with them. I mean, it'd like to spit them out as soon as I inserted the DVD, and oftentimes I would have to pivot the MacBook Pro on its side to actually get the DVD to start playing. But yeah, if I left it flat, I would throw the disc in and it would just spit it right back out and just would pretend it never happened. Quite a hilarious approach, and also a bunch of just kind of missing things that went wrong with this MacBook Pro over time. So for one, I don't know exactly who's to blame for this, but the webcam doesn't work anymore. When I open Photo Booth, it basically just says no camera is connected at all. I don't think it's a firmware problem because this has dealt with its fair share of drops. There was at least one time I remember it sitting on top of the dirty laundry. Someone who shall remain nameless opened the dirty laundry basket and the MacBook Pro slid off and landed on a tile floor at a house that we don't even live at anymore. And I thought as soon as I heard this heavy behemoth slap against against that tile that it must be dead. There's no way it survived that. But sure enough, we opened it up and it still works. You know, all the files are still accessible. Granted, very, very slow because it's not using an SSD. It's a 250 gigabyte traditional spinning hard drive, so that has not aged gracefully. And before you all comment, yes, I'm fully aware. You can open these things up and pop in SSDs and make them boot much, much faster. I've had more than one friend in my personal life upgrade their old MacBook Pros, but don't worry, I got a M1 Max, so not necessary anymore. But aside from the webcam not working and the DVD drive being very picky with how you insert DVDs, it still works fairly well. You know, it connects to the Wi-Fi and it can load web pages, it can send texts, and I was trying to do a Geekbench test for you, although it cannot run the latest Geekbench 5. I was hoping to do a Geekbench 4 comparison with my MacBook Pro, which, because Geekbench 4 is not optimized for Apple Silicon, it had to do a virtual test where it performed pretty well, but for whatever reason, it could not complete the graphics test for Geekbench 4 on the older MacBook Pro. So you'll have to look up the original scores to find out how fast the Intel Core Duo chip was with 2.5 gigahertz of speed. I know, pretty insane. But between these two, I bet you would imagine the one with NVIDIA graphics cards would do much better, right? Until you realize that, yeah, this thing was rocking NVIDIA graphics, but it was only 250 megabytes of video memory, so not exactly top-tier gaming performance to expect, although chess did still open in play. This was kind of the peak of Apple being known for not so good at gaming, and obviously, as you can tell, 13 years later, that situation really hasn't changed much. I mean, Macs can game just about as good as cars can go in reverse. It's like, yes, it's technically possible to play some games on the Mac, although they're definitely not designed for it, and probably not for very long. The other thing I found interesting about comparing these two designs all these years later is, of course, the touch bar was introduced and scrapped within these 13 years, so you still have your full row of function keys, although the MacBook Pro now doesn't have an eject key anymore, it just has Touch ID, which is probably a far better use of space, although the eject key probably was fairly practical back when we had CDs and DVDs in our laptops. Now, not so useful anymore, but the keyboard layouts have not really changed that much either. I mean, we still have the inverted T arrow keys. Now in 2021, the keys are definitely a lot larger, but they're still the traditional scissor key approach. You know, Apple introduced and abandoned the butterfly key mechanism between these two machines. And the general layout of the speakers and trackpad and the space above the keyboard have all pretty much remained the same. Slight differences would include a power button, which is still technically present on the old MacBook Pro, as well as charging indicator lights. Apple must have been loving LEDs when this thing came out, because not only does it have a sleep light that at nighttime, if the MacBook has a charge, it will go on and off, and we quickly realized how annoying that is, because if you're trying to sleep in a dark room and you have a MacBook saying, I'm sleeping, it just wakes up everybody, and it's quite frustrating. So I'm glad Apple went away with that, but there's a button on the side that you can press where it lights up these lights to let you know how much battery you actually have left in the machine, which is kind of a cool quirk that some techies out there might appreciate if it's just too much work for you to open your MacBook and see what the battery percentage is. Although maybe charging indicators mattered a lot more back then, because when this MacBook launched, Apple was advertising up to 7 hours of battery life. I know, pretty insane, right? But the truth is, this MacBook Pro probably has the best battery life in any laptop I've ever seen. Seriously, Apple made or whoever, I cannot think of anyone that's clocking like 25 hours of video playback or 15 hours of web browsing. It's just unheard of in the laptop space, especially with Intel and AMD being more and more power hungry these days. Thanks to Apple Silicon being extremely efficient, you just never see laptops with battery life that good. So charging indicator probably doesn't matter too much. You know, if you've charged this thing within the last 30 days, it probably has some juice left in it. Whereas this thing, yeah, checking the charging indicator was probably fairly logical. One thing that hadn't made its way onto the MacBook Pro yet, though, is the HDMI port, which of course has made its comeback in the 2021 model, but you were pretty much stuck with the mini display port on this MacBook, which could be used with a fair share of Apple-branded external monitors. Hopefully that can come back in today's world. But yeah, all of the legacy I/O certainly takes up a lot more space and makes the edge of the chassis look look like more of Swiss cheese style. In fact, it's honestly impressive with this unibody design, which Apple was very, very proud of when they first unveiled it in 2008, that they were able to stuff an entire Ethernet port on the side of this MacBook Pro. Frankly, it's amazing if you consider the 2021 model actually isn't that much thinner. I mean, if you could reach through the YouTube screen right now and pick up these two MacBook Pros, you would notice that, yes, this one is a bit thicker and also a lot heavier than the 2021 model, but if we just compare overall thickness, they're actually really dang close, and there was fairly little room for error to include an entire Ethernet port on the 2009 MacBook Pro, but they did it. They stuffed it in there and made it work, and unfortunately, not even through the power brick am I able to get Ethernet on the MacBook, so that means gonna have to resort to a dongle, even though Apple included Legacy I/O with the new machine. Probably the most noticeable difference if you were opening up two of these laptops is the bezels. I mean, they're pretty freaking chonk once you've got used to the new 16-inch MacBook Pros, but I feel like I've been spoiled with this gorgeous display, which I frankly think is the best display Apple has ever made on any of their devices. Whereas these are, you know, they're quite up there, they're quite chonk, although I will still give them credit. At this time, having black bezels on a MacBook was actually kind of a new thing, and that has actually kept its design approach across the MacBook line for all these years. Hopefully, Apple keeps the black bezel trend going and doesn't see any reason to change it, right? I mean, heck, even the 2009 MacBook Pro bezels are thinner than my iMac Pro bezels, and those came out in 2017, so I guess it's not the worst bezels in the world, not the thinnest or the thickest, but keep in mind this was also pre-Retina display, so yeah, you were not even getting a 1080p display for like an $1,800 15-inch MacBook Pro, which at the time, I guess, might have left more to be desired when it comes to resolution and pixel density. However, maybe I'm just not a pixel density junkie as much as others out there. Having used this one for several weeks now and then jumping back to this all of a sudden, I really didn't care or notice the pixel density being that much lower. I think at an average viewing distance, even the 900p display that this thing has rocking on it is not that bad. It's decent, and for something this old, I honestly expected it to be a tad worse. Maybe Retina displays are slightly overrated, at least for screens this big, but probably the most noticeable difference in day-to-day use, aside from pixel density for me, was actually the speaker quality. I don't have a brand new 2009 MacBook Pro to compare this one to, so I might be listening to damaged goods here, but when I started playing a song on the 2009 MacBook Pro, it literally sounded worse than my phone speakers. I don't know what the dots on the side of the keyboard are for on this thing, because that's not where the speaker is. I was picking it up and holding it in different directions, and I was like, did the speaker like fall out or something? Seriously, wouldn't be surprised if mine ends up being damaged, but it literally sounds atrocious. There's no bass at all. You can't hear a single low frequency, and honestly, I can't even hear midtones with these speakers. It's really impressive how low the frequencies can get on my 16-inch MacBook Pro. They sound fantastic, and I have never had the desire to plug in my 16-inch MacBook Pro to a pair of speakers because they sound great. Whereas this was like an embarrassment. It was like a notch above the iPod Nano speaker back when it had one in the 5th gen. Honestly, it was on par with my Apple Watch speaker, which I don't know how it could possibly be that bad. So I'm gonna go ahead and assume there's something wrong with the speakers from that drop that we had a few years ago, but they still technically play audio. Oh, it's so bad. I'm also very thankful that Apple leaned in on the trackpad size. That's probably another very noticeable difference you guys can tell. Using the trackpad from 2009, it makes you wonder, like, why did we design it this way? Why not just take up as much space as you possibly can to have all of that flexibility when you're navigating Windows? And it's not just the size that matters, it's also the haptic feedback of the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Obviously, top notch as we're used to with Apple's MacBooks, but using the non-solid state trackpad on the 2009 MacBook Pro, it is so crunchy. I mean, not in a good way. I mean, it feels like you're trying to break it every time you click down, and that's probably what led to most people, and I assume Steve Jobs as well, not actually clicking all the way. They just tap. They just lightly tap to let the computer know what you want to do. But the hard drive is so old, it's making noises that I'm hearing on the outside that sometimes you'll lightly tap something trying to close a window or trying to open a window, and it won't respond. It won't do what you're asking. And because it's so unresponsive, you start clicking harder and harder, and you just hear this very, very loud every single time you click in. It's also a much more hollow design. I haven't opened up one of these things before, but frankly, you can just tell by holding it and pressuring it that there's a lot of empty space on the inside of this machine, whereas this boy is packed. You know, I wouldn't be shocked if he's even partly water resistant because there is no hollow space feeling on the inside of this guy at all, despite them both being made of aluminum and both having very similar design approaches, although I'm very grateful Apple decided to go away with the MacBook Pro lettering at the bottom of the display. Kind of my same thought process with books. It's like, I know what I'm using. You don't have to tell me at all times what this machine is. I get it. It's a MacBook Pro. You don't need the lettering. So obviously I prefer the newer design by far, but seeing how many similarities Apple has kept after 13 years is frankly kind of impressive, and I'm glad that we've kind of refined this design. After all these years of iPads launching, keep in mind, the iPad did not exist when this MacBook Pro came out, and we've now had 10 years of iPads, and Apple still has not budged on no touch displays on their laptops, which honestly I think is kind of admirable to them, saying, no, this is what matters with a laptop. We want to go all in with a keyboard and mouse, and that's what matters. And I think they've prioritized that in a great way and resulted in consistently positive experience between people buying MacBook Pros in the early 2000s and still buying them into the 2020s, and seeing how much better the displays have gotten. Obviously, great dynamic range, great refresh rate, but of course, battery life and performance being prioritized, and still getting as much screen real estate as possible. It's honestly kind of amazing how much bigger the display feels on this thing, even though the form factor is pretty much identical to the footprint of this MacBook Pro. I tried to line them up best I could. If anything, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is probably a little bit smaller in overall footprint that it takes up, but still, they're able to fit a nearly 100 watt-hour battery, whereas back then they were not even over 80 watt-hours. And I think this comparison can show that over time, not everything needs to be reinvented, Sometimes form factors in footprints are good, and they can stay that way, and refinement can be appreciated. I think that many news sites out there and many tech YouTubers, including myself, elected this MacBook Pro as the best tech product of the year. It exceeded our expectations. It was an amazing value. The performance, the battery life, the I/O, everything was great. And look at overall how few differences there really are between these two in terms of overall form factor. It's still a laptop. It's still a display lid with a keyboard and a trackpad and some speakers on the side, and we call it a day. And yet we loved this thing despite there being fairly little fundamental changes 13 years ago. So that's what I want to preface with future tech products, like what is going to happen with smartphones or Apple Watches or iPads in another 12 to 13 years. I feel like they might not have to change from a fundamental footprint level. I think that we will still have glass rectangles, and we will still have digital crowns or rounded corners or rounded chassis in another decade, but that's okay, because refinement and perfecting a design and getting it better and just improving what's already been set out, that can result in some of the greatest products that any of us use on a day-to-day basis. So hats off to Apple for making a 2009 laptop that's still technically kind of usable. I'm sure a battery replacement and an SSD swap would make this thing far more usable than it is currently, but I, of course, will be holding on to my 2021 MacBook Pro for daily editing. However, I'm very happy to announce that this entire video was actually edited on the no, I'm kidding. I'm not gonna do that. I don't think this video would fit on the hard drive, and I'm pretty sure it's about to die any second. Like, it's just gonna shut off and stop working before I know it. So either way, though, an impressive amount of engineering that has shown us a small amount of change over the years, but that says a lot about how Apple nailed the footprint and the form factor, and refinement over years and years can make a truly groundbreaking product. So let me know what your guys' MacBook Pro stories are. Are you still using MacBook Pros from 2009 or 2012? Did you upgrade the SSDs? All that good stuff. Let me know what you're thinking down below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.